Billionaire lined up models for his daughter to choose, a mom her choice, left everyone speechless. She was just the maid, until the billionaire's daughter called her mom in front of everyone. Humiliated, he threw her out only to realize hours later that she was the only one who could save his child's life. What happened next would shake his entire world. Watch until the end to see how one man's pride turned into the fight of his life. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? The evening air inside the Carter estate was thick with the mingling scents of polished wood, expensive cologne, and the faint perfume of fresh orchids arranged in every corner of the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, their faceted light spilling across a sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits. Tonight was the anniversary gala of Carter Industries, a celebration of its 3 decades of dominance in the construction and real estate sectors. For Robert Carter, the event was more than a social occasion. It was a showcase of power, influence, and prestige. From the moment the first guest had stepped onto the marble-floored entrance hall, the night had been carefully choreographed. Uniformed servers moved like clockwork between the guests, balancing trays of champagne flutes that caught the light like molten gold. The orchestra played a slow, elegant waltz, its music weaving through the polite chatter of the city's elite. Near the edge of the hall, 9-year-old Emma Carter stood in a pale cream dress, her dark hair neatly tied back with a satin ribbon. She wasn't supposed to be here, not exactly. Robert had instructed the nanny to keep her upstairs during the main speeches, but Emma had insisted. She wanted to see her father address the crowd. She wanted to be near him, even if he was busy being Mr. Carter rather than Dad. But as the evening wore on, Emma's attention wandered. She had spotted Grace Miller at the far side of the room, a young woman in a simple navy blue uniform, carrying a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen door. Grace worked in the Carter household, though she was far more than just an employee to Emma. She was the one who sat by her bed when nightmares chased away her sleep, who made her soup when she was sick, who listened when no one else seemed to have the time. In the months since Emma's mother had passed away, Grace's quiet presence had become a kind of anchor. Emma's small heart swelled with determination. She didn't care about the stares or the whispers she might cause. In her mind, there was nothing wrong with telling the truth. When her father concluded his latest conversation with a city councilman and a pair of investors, Emma stepped forward into the open space near the center of the hall. The chatter dimmed slightly. She was, after all, the late Mrs. Carter's daughter and the heir to the Carter name. Lifting her chin, Emma spoke in a clear, unwavering voice that seemed far too steady for a child her age. "I choose Grace," she announced, the words cutting clean through the murmurs. "I want her to be my mother." The room froze. Glasses halted midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the small girl standing in her pale dress, her finger pointing not at any of the 3 elegant women who had been subtly positioning themselves near Robert all evening, but at the young black maid in the navy uniform by the doorway. Grace had just stepped in with her tray when the words hit her. Her steps faltered, and she stood motionless, the weight of the sudden attention pressing down on her. She could feel dozens of eyes, some curious, some hostile, slide from Emma to her. Robert Carter's voice came like a thunderclap. "No, Emma." His tone was sharp, his face flushing crimson. "That filthy maid will never be allowed to be your mother." Gasps rippled through the hall. A couple in the corner exchanged horrified glances. Others masked their reactions behind polite sips of champagne. Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. She had heard insults before, felt the sting of prejudice in whispered remarks or subtle gestures, but never so publicly. Never from the man whose child she cared for as though she were her own. The 3 women who had been standing near Robert moments earlier, each stunning in her own way, exchanged glances laced with satisfaction. The blonde in a silver gown stepped forward, her lips curling into a smirk. "This is absurd," she said to Emma, her voice sweetened with mockery. "That woman cleans toilets, darling. Do you think your mother would have wanted that?" The brunette in an emerald dress leaned down slightly, her words dripping venom. "Look at her. Dust on her cuffs, the smell of cleaning products in her hair. Do you really want someone like that teaching you to be a lady?" The tallest, dressed in crimson silk, didn't bother to hide her contempt. People like her come from dirt, and they stay in dirt. I'm sure her mother scrubbed floors too, if she even had one worth mentioning. Grace's hands tightened around the tray. The insults to herself she could take, but the moment they dragged her mother into it, a line was crossed. Her voice, low but steady, carried more weight than any raised shout. "You don't talk about my mother," Grace said, the steel in her tone slicing through the air. "And you don't talk about the people I love." The women gave a chorus of derisive laughter. "Oh, how noble," the one in crimson sneered. "Defending your little maid's honor, Emma. But this is a world of money and status, not fairy tales." Robert's patience snapped. In a sudden violent motion, he snatched the crystal glass from the table beside him and hurled it. The glass struck Grace on the side of the head, shattering into glittering shards in a spray of water. A collective gasp filled the room. Grace stumbled back, one hand rising to her temple, warm blood seeping between her fingers. "Get out of my house," Robert roared, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "You're finished here, Grace. Pack your things and be gone before morning." Emma's voice cracked like a whip in response. "No, you can't do that. She's my family." Tears streamed down her face as she stepped forward, but Robert ignored her. His hand closed firmly around her small arm. "Enough. You've embarrassed me enough for one night," he growled, dragging her toward the grand staircase. "Let me go. I want Grace. I want her." Emma's cries echoed through the hall, each word a wound. Grace stood frozen, heart pounding, blood dripping onto the polished marble floor. Every instinct told her to run to Emma, to wrap her in her arms and promise it would be all right. But the look in Robert's eyes warned her that any move now would only make things worse. Upstairs in the gilded bedroom that had once belonged to her mother, Emma sobbed into her pillow. "She's always there for me," she choked out. "When I'm sick, when I can't sleep, when you're not home." Robert stood at the window, staring out into the cold city lights. "Go to sleep, Emma. This discussion is over." The next morning, winter sunlight cast a cold sheen across the Carter estate. The frost on the hedges sparkled under a pale blue sky, but inside the house felt heavy with unspoken tension. Emma, hollow-eyed from crying through the night, wandered outside into the garden. She walked aimlessly, her shoes crunching over the frosted grass, until she reached the pond at the far edge of the grounds. A thin layer of ice clung to the water's surface, fragile and deceptive. She sat on the stone edge, absently kicking a loose pebble. Her mind was far away, caught between anger at her father and the ache of missing Grace. She didn't notice when her foot slipped. The world tilted. There was a splash, a sharp cry, and then the icy water swallowed her. From across the lawn, Grace heard it, the desperate, high-pitched scream of a child in danger. She didn't think, didn't pause. Her boots pounded across the frozen grass, breath burning in her lungs as she ran. Without hesitation, she dove into the frigid pond. The cold was a shock that stole her breath, but she pushed through it, her hands finding Emma's small arm beneath the water. "Hold on," Grace gasped, pulling with every ounce of strength she had. The ice cracked and shifted under her grip, but she kept going, hauling Emma toward the bank. By the time Robert arrived, his long coat flaring behind him as he sprinted across the lawn, Grace was kneeling in the mud, wrapping her coat around the shivering girl. Emma clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder. Robert stopped short. The sight was like a blade to his chest. His daughter, clutching the woman he had thrown out less than 12 hours earlier. For the first time, something heavier than pride pressed against his ribs. Guilt. Maya. He caught himself, realizing he'd never called her by her first name before. "Grace, The words faltered. He swallowed, his voice cracking. "I was wrong, deeply wrong about you, and about what matters." Emma looked up at him, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Can she stay? Please." Robert hesitated, searching Grace's face for any sign of disdain or triumph. There was none, only a woman who was cold, wet, and holding his daughter as if she were her own. "Yes," he said finally, "she can stay, for as long as she'll have us." And for the first time in years, the Carter estate felt just a little warmer. The frost still clung to the garden hedges the morning after Grace pulled Emma from the icy pond. The winter sun spilled across the Carter estate, but its light did little to warm the atmosphere inside the grand house. The events of the previous night had left invisible marks on everyone. On Robert, whose pride had been rattled, on Emma, who refused to leave Grace's side, and on Grace herself, who now found her place in the household dangerously undefined. Robert had called her into his study early that morning. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the sharp bitterness of freshly brewed coffee. He sat behind the large mahogany desk, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood as though weighing every word before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "What I said at the gala, what I did was inexcusable. You saved Emma's life last night, and—" He hesitated, glancing briefly at her. "And I realize you've been saving her in ways I haven't been able to see." Grace stood in the doorway, her posture calm but guarded. She's a child who lost her mother. She needs someone who's there, every day, not just for moments. Robert nodded, the admission settling heavily between them. "I want you to stay, not as staff, not as a temporary caretaker, but as Emma's full-time guardian. Proper pay, benefits, respect." His jaw tightened on the last word, as though it tasted unfamiliar. Grace didn't answer right away. She studied him, searching for traces of the arrogance she had seen in him the night before. There was still steel in his posture, but the sharpness had dulled into something more human. "If I stay," she said finally, "it's because of Emma. She comes first in everything." "You have my word," Robert replied, and for once he sounded like he meant it. By mid-morning, the household was buzzing with whispers. News traveled fast among the staff, and it seemed every housekeeper and gardener now knew that the incident at the gala had ended with Robert Carter publicly defending Grace's role in Emma's life. The whispers weren't all kind. Some carried skepticism, others outright disapproval. It didn't take long for the ripples to reach beyond the estate. That afternoon, as Robert and Grace sat with Emma in the library, reading from a worn copy of The Secret Garden, Patricia Vance, the Carter family's PR consultant, arrived unannounced. A sharp woman in her 40s with perfectly coiffed hair, she wasted no time. "Robert, the footage of the rescue is everywhere," she said, setting her tablet on the table. A video played a security camera's grainy view of Grace plunging into the pond, hauling Emma out, and wrapping her in a coat. "It's gone viral. People are calling her a hero." Grace blinked at the word, uncomfortable. "I was just doing what anyone would." "Not anyone," Patricia countered. "You've captured the public's sympathy, but," she added with a glance at Robert, "that comes with complications. There's already speculation about your relationship to her, and certain circles are less than pleased." Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Certain circles was PR speak for the social elite business partners or investors and the sort of friends who thought pedigree mattered more than character. The following week, the quiet fracture became visible. It began with the phone calls old acquaintances ringing Robert under the guise of concern. "We saw the news," they would say, their voices dripping with thinly veiled judgment. "She seems devoted, but you must understand how this looks." Others were less subtle, warning him outright that keeping Grace in such a visible role could erode the Carter brand. Robert responded with the same clipped politeness to all of them, but each conversation left a trace of irritation. Grace could feel it building in the way he moved through the house, in the sharper tone he used with his lawyers, in the late nights spent at his desk. Emma, oblivious to the subtler politics, blossomed under Grace's constant presence. She insisted on having breakfast with her every morning, pulling her into the garden to inspect the rose bushes and asking her to read bedtime stories each night. For the first time in months, she smiled freely. It was in those moments, watching Emma laugh, seeing her curl up in Grace's lap, that Robert began to notice something uncomfortable. His daughter seemed more herself with Grace than she ever had with him. But not everyone who entered the Carter estate brought warmth. One afternoon, while Grace was in the kitchen helping the chef prepare Emma's favorite vegetable soup, the butler announced visitors. 3 women stepped into the marble-floored entryway, their heels clicking like a metronome of disdain. Grace recognized them instantly. They had been at the gala, circling Robert like perfume-laced vultures. "Ladies," Robert greeted them coolly, "what brings you here?" "We came to make peace," the blonde in silver said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The press is buzzing, and we thought we could help. Control the story." The brunette in emerald let her gaze drift deliberately toward Grace, lingering just long enough to make the insult clear. "Not everyone is thrilled about your arrangement." Grace set the ladle down, her hands curling into fists inside her apron pockets. The tallest, in crimson silk, stepped forward, her voice dropping to a cutting whisper. "Let's be honest, Robert. You can dress her up, but she'll always be what she is. Do you really think the other CEOs will let their children play with Emma if her mother figure is someone who used to scrub their floors?" The words slid under Grace's skin like a blade. She had learned long ago not to let such remarks show, but the mention of Emma cut deeper than she could hide. Her voice came low and steady. "You don't talk about me like I'm not standing here, and you certainly don't talk about Emma like she's some pawn in your game." The blonde laughed, the sound brittle. "Careful, dear. You're just an employee." "Enough!" Robert's voice snapped through the air. He stepped between them, his jaw tight. "Grace is part of this family now. If you can't respect that, you're not welcome here." The women exchanged glances, their smugness faltering. "This won't last," the one in crimson muttered before they turned and left. That evening over dinner, Emma noticed the tension. "What happened?" she asked, her fork hovering over her plate. "Just some people who don't understand," Grace said gently. "Nothing for you to worry about." Emma frowned. "If they don't understand, then that's their problem, not ours." "Come nowhere." Robert glanced at Grace, and for a moment, both of them saw the same truth. The clarity of a child's heart often cut through the noise of adult pride and prejudice. The next morning, Robert called Patricia. "I want to hold a press conference," he said. "Here, at the estate." "That's bold," she replied. "You'll make enemies in certain circles." "I already have," Robert said flatly. "I'd rather have the right ones." 2 days later, the East Lawn was transformed into a small press venue. A podium stood before neat rows of chairs, and cameras were already trained on it. Grace stood with Emma to the side, her hands resting protectively on the girl's shoulders. Robert stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady. "Many of you know about the incident at the gala and what followed. There's been speculation, gossip, and prejudice. I'm here to put that to rest. Grace Miller is not the help. She is family. She is the person my daughter trusts most in the world. She has saved Emma's life, not just once, but in ways you won't see on the evening news. She will remain in this home as Emma's full-time caregiver, with my full support and respect." The cameras clicked furiously. A few reporters shouted questions, but Robert raised a hand. "That's all I have to say. Those who can't accept it are free to walk away from my life." From the sidelines, Grace felt a swell of conflicting emotions, pride, relief, and a cautious hope. Emma squeezed her hand, her small smile radiant. For the first time since the gala, Grace allowed herself to believe she might truly belong. The morning after the press conference was quiet in the Carter estate, at least on the surface. The early sunlight spilled over the frost-kissed lawns, and inside the household staff went about their routines with practiced precision. Yet beneath that calm, an unease thrummed like a low, steady drumbeat. Robert Carter had expected resistance from certain quarters after his public declaration about Grace, but he hadn't anticipated the speed or venom of the counterattack. By mid-morning, his phone was already vibrating with calls from former associates. Some offered polite congratulations wrapped in cautionary advice. Others didn't bother to sugarcoat their disapproval, but none of those voices worried him as much as the silence from Andre Morris. Morris had once been Robert's most trusted business partner, a man with whom he had built Carter Industries' most profitable ventures. Their split years ago had been ugly, a tangle of lawsuits and accusations, but Morris had faded into the background. Until now. Robert could feel his presence in the sudden uptick of media inquiries, the pointed questions about Grace's real motives, and the half-formed rumors already seeping into industry gossip. The first open strike came 2 days later. Grace had taken Emma into town to buy supplies for a school art project. A quiet afternoon, just the two of them walking along a bustling sidewalk. The winter sun reflected off the shop windows, and their breath curled into white clouds in the cold air. Emma was chattering about the color of glitter they should choose when a man stepped out from an alleyway, camera hanging from his neck. "Grace Miller?" His tone was oily, practiced. Grace's instincts prickled. "Yes," she said, keeping Emma close. "Care to comment on the rumors?" he asked, raising his camera without waiting for a reply. The shutter clicked. "That you're more than just the nanny? That you've been planning this since the day you stepped into the Carter house?" Grace's jaw tightened. "I don't owe you anything," she said sharply, ushering Emma toward the car. The man's voice followed them. "We'll find out the truth one way or another." By the time they returned to the estate, Robert was waiting in the foyer, having been alerted by the driver. Grace's account of the encounter lit a cold fire in his eyes. "They're escalating," he said, his tone clipped, "which means Morris is getting desperate." That evening, Robert made a call to Roland Pierce, a friend from his early business days who had since become one of the most sought-after tech security consultants in the city. Roland arrived the next morning, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket, his eyes scanning every corner of the estate as though it were a battlefield. "Find me every thread that leads back to Morris," Robert instructed. "Every call, every payment, every whisper. I want proof before they print a single word more about Grace." Roland grinned faintly. "If there's dirt, I'll dig it up." 2 days later, the house was holding its breath again. Grace did her best to keep Emma's world normal, morning reading in the library, afternoons in the garden, but her own sleep was restless. She had lived with prejudice before, but never with a campaign this calculated, this personal. It wasn't just about her. It was about painting her as a threat to Emma, and that made her blood run cold. On the third night, Roland returned with results. He dropped a thick folder on Robert's desk in the study. "Morris is the source. Payments to a gossip columnist, direct messages to the photographer who harassed Grace. And here," he tapped a printed email, "instructions to dig into her family history. He wants to paint her as a gold digger." Robert's jaw tightened. This is enough to bury him. Grace stood in the doorway listening. The knowledge that Morris was behind it all was both infuriating and strangely clarifying. There was no more guesswork, now they had a target. Robert didn't waste time. The next morning, Patricia came to the estate for an urgent strategy meeting. She studied the evidence with the sharp eye of someone who had navigated more than a few scandals. "This is gold," she said. "The moment this hits the media, Morris's credibility is gone. But," she glanced at Robert, "the board might see this as you taking a personal vendetta public. It could cost you your seat." Robert didn't hesitate. "If my seat at the table depends on tolerating someone like Morris, it's not worth keeping." Patricia smiled faintly. "Then we go all in." While Patricia prepared the media rollout, Robert doubled the estate's security. Guard rotations were tightened, motion sensors checked twice daily, and the staff instructed to report any unusual deliveries or visitors immediately. Grace appreciated the precautions, but the undercurrent of tension was inescapable. Emma had begun to pick up on it too, sticking closer to Grace than usual. One particularly cold evening, Grace was helping Emma into her pajamas when a loud metallic clang echoed from the east gate. Seconds later, the estate alarm blared. Robert's voice came over the intercom. "Grace, stay in Emma's room and lock the door." Through the upstairs window, Grace could see flashlights cutting across the frozen lawn. The intruder, a man dressed in black, was caught trying to cut through the gate's locking mechanism. In his pocket, security found a small USB drive. Roland examined it in the control room. Encrypted. Could be anything. Photos, floor plans, financial data. Robert didn't wait for speculation. The man was handed over to the police, and charges were filed. But the message was clear. This was no longer just a smear campaign. The following morning, the local paper carried a small, vague article about the break-in. No mention of Morris, but Robert knew better than to think the connection didn't exist. That afternoon, Patricia arrived with new intel. Morris isn't working alone. He's got at least 2 other former associates feeding him resources. If we want to end this, we can't just defend. We have to dismantle the network. Robert's reply was immediate. Then that's what we'll do. The plan came together over the next 48 hours. Roland tracked communications between Morris and his allies. Patricia lined up trusted journalists willing to expose the conspiracy. Grace, though uneasy about being at the center of the storm, offered to testify publicly if needed. Their break came sooner than expected. Roland intercepted an email chain discussing a package scheduled to be delivered to the Carter estate. The tone was unmistakably threatening. The next morning at 10:17 a.m., a delivery van arrived at the gate. The driver presented a medium-sized box with no return address. Security scanned it. No explosives, but Robert's instincts told him not to take chances. He opened it carefully, wearing gloves. Inside was a framed photograph. Grace taken from outside the greenhouse, unaware she was being watched. In the blurred background, Emma's laughter was frozen in a sunlit moment. Grace stared at it, her stomach twisting. "He's in my space," she murmured. "No," Robert said, his voice hard. "He's in our space, and now we make him regret it." That night, as the estate settled into uneasy silence, Robert and Grace stood in the study, the photograph lying on the desk between them. They both knew the next move had to be decisive. "This isn't just about defending ourselves anymore," Robert said quietly. "It's about ending this." Grace met his gaze, her own voice steady. "Then let's finish it." The night after the photograph arrived, the Carter estate did not sleep easily. The guards walked their patrols with tighter formation, radios murmuring in clipped updates. Security cameras swept the grounds in mechanical arcs, their infrared lenses glowing faintly in the dark. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, as though the entire house was holding its breath. Robert knew that Morris would not stop until he was forced to, and forcing him to stop meant more than proving his guilt. It meant shattering the network that gave him power. If they could cut him off from his allies, his resources, and the press that amplified his lies, they could end this for good. He sat in his study with Grace, Roland, and Patricia gathered around the mahogany desk. The framed photograph lay in the center, its glass catching the lamplight. "This is the line," Robert said quietly. "He's crossed into our home. He's involved Emma now. There's no coming back from that." Patricia tapped the table with a manicured finger. "Then we set the trap, something public, somewhere he can't resist showing his face, and where we control the ground." Roland grinned faintly. "And where we can record everything." Grace folded her arms. "You want to use me as bait?" Robert shook his head. "Not bait-proof. You'll be there, but surrounded by security, cameras, and people we trust. All he has to do is make one move, and it's over." The opportunity came in the form of the city's annual Winter Charity Gala, a high-profile event attended by political leaders, celebrities, and the kind of business figures Morris loved to schmooze. The guest list was practically a directory of influence. Patricia secured invitations for Robert and Grace within hours. The plan was simple in outline, but risky in execution. Attend the gala together, let Morris see them in a public setting, and wait for him to make his move, whether through confrontation, an associate's actions, or some attempt to plant another scandal. On the evening of the gala, the Carter estate hummed with a strange mixture of tension and ceremony. Grace emerged from her quarters in a floor-length midnight blue gown, her hair swept back to reveal the faint scar along her temple from the night of the gala weeks earlier. Emma, allowed to peek in before her bedtime, beamed at the sight. "You look like a queen," she said earnestly. Grace smiled, smoothing a hand over the girl's hair. "And you're my princess. Be good for Mrs. Klein tonight, okay?" Robert appeared in the doorway in a perfectly cut black tuxedo. His eyes lingered on Grace for a moment before he offered his arm. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," she replied. The gala was held at the Grand Hanover Hotel, its marble lobby ablaze with light and sound. The chandeliers glittered overhead, casting their reflections in the polished floors. The crowd was a swirling mix of power and wealth, each smile measured, each handshake calculated. Cameras flashed as Robert and Grace stepped into the main ballroom together. A murmur swept through the crowd. some curious, some disapproving, others clearly impressed by the boldness of their public appearance side by side. Patricia was already working the edges of the room, greeting allies and scanning for Morris. Roland, in an unassuming dark suit, stayed close enough to keep them in view without drawing attention. It didn't take long. Within half an hour, Patricia's voice crackled softly over the small earpiece Robert wore. "He's here, near the bar, talking to a reporter from the Ledger." Robert's jaw tightened. Of course, that's his favorite outlet for planting stories. Grace followed his gaze. Across the room, Morris stood with his back to the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, his tailored suit and easy posture broadcasting confidence. But when his eyes flicked toward them, the smile didn't reach his gaze. "Remember," Robert murmured to Grace, "we don't go to him. We let him come to us." Morris didn't make them wait long. 20 minutes later, he approached, all false charm and polished manners. "Robert," he said smoothly. "Grace, enjoying the evening?" Robert's tone was cool. "We were." Morris ignored him, focusing on Grace. "I must say, you clean up well, almost convincing." Grace met his eyes without flinching. "Convincing enough to be here as Robert's guest. Convincing enough to be worth your time, apparently." The smile thinned. "You're playing a dangerous game." "So are you," she replied evenly. "Difference is, I'm not the one who's already been caught cheating." For a heartbeat, his expression hardened before he leaned in slightly, voice low. "You think tonight's about you? It's about reminding Robert that everyone he cares for can be touched." Before Robert could respond, commotion broke out near the ballroom entrance. 2 security guards were restraining a man who was struggling violently, a camera falling from his grasp. Roland was there in seconds, grabbing the device before it could be damaged. "That guy's on Morris's payroll," Roland said quickly when Robert reached him. "He was trying to plant doctored photos in the press room." "Get the police involved," Robert ordered, "and make sure the connection to Morris is public record." Morris stood at a distance now, watching the scene unfold with a faint smirk. But it faded when 2 police officers began taking statements in full view of the gathered guests. Cameras, real ones, were now snapping away, capturing his tense expression as he slipped out of the ballroom. The following morning, the headlines were brutal. Billionaire's former partner, linked to stage scandal at charity gala articles, detailed the break-in at the Carter estate, the photograph, and now the attempted planting of fake images. Public opinion swung sharply. Even some of Morris's longtime allies began to distance themselves. Patricia, sitting in Robert's study with a triumphant smile, said, "He's finished. The board knows it. I've already had 2 members called to separate themselves from him." Grace allowed herself a slow exhale. "So, it's over?" Robert shook his head. "Not yet. A wounded man can still lash out, but he's running out of ground." Later that week, the final blow came. Roland uncovered a trove of financial records, illicit payments, offshore accounts, contracts with falsified signatures, all linked to Morris's remaining associates. Robert's legal team moved quickly, turning the material over to the authorities. On a rainy Thursday morning, Morris was arrested at his downtown penthouse. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs played on every news channel. Robert watched the coverage with Grace standing beside him. The relief in the room was palpable, but so was the fatigue. "He's gone," Robert said quietly. "But this, all of this, had a price." Grace nodded. "We kept Emma safe. That's what matters most." A week later, the Carter estate opened its gates, not for another press conference or security patrol, but for something entirely different. Robert had decided that if their home had been the battleground, it should also be the place where they celebrated survival. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues were invited to a garden gathering. Tables were set up among the roses, and children played on the lawn while music floated from a quartet beneath the gazebo. Emma darted between the guests, introducing Grace to everyone with the proud announcement, "This is my family." When the sun began to set, casting the garden in golden light, Robert stood beside Grace and addressed the crowd. "This estate has always been a symbol of legacy," he said, "but today it represents something far more important. The power of family, of standing together, and of choosing what's right no matter the cost." Applause rose, warm and sustained, Grace felt Emma's small hand slip into hers. That night after the guests departed, the three of them sat in the quiet of the library. Emma curled against Grace's side, already drifting to sleep, while Robert watched them with an expression that was no longer guarded, no longer burdened by pride. They had weathered the storm. And though the world outside would always carry its share of shadows, inside these walls there was light earned, protected, and shared. The price had been high, but the choice to stand together had been worth everything. If this story moved you, don't leave without subscribing. There are more true-to-life stories you won't believe until you hear them. Click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your next favorite story is already waiting.